As professionals who work with families and with youth, it is important that we recognize this concept of cultural competence. And one thing that you'll hear repeatedly through these sessions is the relationship between context and culture. All too often, we've gone to diversity trainings or sensitivity trainings, even sexual harassment trainings, and they've taught us the do's and don'ts about how to interact with others. Do this and don't do that. Be mindful of this and don't think about that. Right. And one of the things that I have found myself is that many of those trainings have been wanting, that they have been found wanting. They've missed some important crucial pieces, and that is the context. And so as we think about cultural competence, we have to think about the context that cultures are developed in. And so we'll spend some time talking about that. But more importantly, cultural competence is less about those do's and don'ts and more about understanding our own selves first. Know thyself. And so when we think about that, some things that should come up for us is the power and privilege that we have, right? So many of us have been born into privilege. So I am a cisgendered African-American male. I have I don't have a felony. I went to college and universities and graduated with advanced degrees, so I have letters behind my last name. And so what I speak English, right? I'm 6'2", and I'm moderately attractive and humble, right? So all of those things are privileges. Some of those privileges are things that I was born into. I didn't have any control over. Some of them were things that I aspired to, I worked towards. And so I have privilege. And as much as I have privilege, I want you to think about what are the privileges that you have and how might they look differently given different contexts. So there's a concept of white privilege that people like to talk about. And I think that's a great way to kind of think about that. But I don't want to limit the conversation to just talking about white privilege, because in a number of systems, we all have privilege. But it's the context that determines how our privilege gets turned into power. Power is the ability to do work. And so in our society, what gives us power to do work? For many of us, it is our racial group, our ethnic heritage, our socioeconomic status, our education, our ability to speak a language or multiple languages. These are things that give us power. And so when we think about diversity, we think about equity, we think about inclusion, and we think about cultural competence, I really want us to think about in what context do I have power, and in what other context do I not have power? And more importantly, how do I use my power to get things done? I would suggest that humanity, that this idea of power and privilege could be used for our own purposes. But I would submit to you that our humanity is not measured in how we collect things for ourselves, but how we work those things in the service of ourselves and in others. An orange tree is, if we took those oranges and we fed it right back to the root of that tree, it would die because the fruit is for others. It is not for the tree itself. And so when we think about our power and privilege, are we using our power and privilege to empower other people, to give them the fruit? Or are we trying to feed it back to ourselves and get all that we can from our own power and privilege? So when people talk about this idea of white supremacy or white privilege, I understand where they're going with that conversation. I would suggest that if we can shift just a little bit, we can actually get to something that is more dynamic or at the root of even white supremacy or white privilege, and that's white primacy. Right? The idea that my existence is primal and everything else is deviant from my primal existence. And so I would say that concept of primacy is not just for white people, but can it happen in a number of different ways, right? So as a social worker, I could say that I have this social work background, and so my way of seeing the world is the way to see the world, is the right way to see the world. I could be a guardian ad litem and say, my job is to look for the best interests of the child, and this is exactly how I see it. I could be a community member and say, the way we do things in this community is the right way, without the recognition in all of those roles that context drives how I need to be effective in each one of those areas.